Oh, thanks, sweetie. Motifs, personification, foreshadowing, symbolism, mood, and then what we know. All right? And I'm going to tell you that your short answer, if you looked at the board, it would tell you that your short answer is going to ask you, yes, ma'am. What?
The things that we look for, like when we annotate with you, are we allowed to use those for our
yes.
glossers?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely you can. So the short answer you're going to be answering asks how Dickens uses symbolism to foreshadow later events in this chapter. So here we go. The wine shop. A large cask of wine had been dropped and broken in the street. The accident had happened in getting it out of the cart. The cask had tumbled out with a run, the hoops had burst, and it lay on the stones just outside the door of the wine shop, shattered like a walnut shell. Okay, so first of all, we obviously know that the shattered like a walnut shell is a what? Okay. So we have a simile, all right? So what is a cask? What's a cask of wine?
It's like a big old thing of wine.
Right. It's going to be a barrel of wine.
You can see on anime a lot.
Okay. All the people within reach had suspended their business or their idleness to run to the spot and drink the wine. Okay, what does this word here indicate, or their idleness? What does that show us?
Yeah,
okay.
Stillness. So
there's stillness. Okay, we have a lack of productivity. Help if I can spell it. Okay, or jobs. Okay, to run to the spot and drink the wine. The rough, irregular stones of the street, pointing every way and designed, one might have thought, expressly to lame all living creatures that approached them, had dammed it into little pools. These were surrounded, each by its own jostling group or crowd according to its size. Some men kneeled down and made scoops of their two hands joined and sipped, or tried to help women who bent over their shoulders to sip before the wine had all run out between their fingers. Other men and women dipped in the puddles with little mugs of mutilated earthenware, or even with handkerchiefs from women's heads, which were squeezed dry into infants' mouths. Others made small mud embankments to stem the wine as it ran. Others, directed by lookers-on at high windows, darted here and there to cut off little streams of wine that started away in new directions. Others devoted themselves to the sodden and lee-dyed pieces of the cask, licking and even champing the moister wine-rotted fragments with eager relish. There was no drainage to carry off the wine, and not only did it all get taken up, but so much mud got taken up along with it that there might have been a scavenger in the street if anyone acquainted with it could have believed in such a miraculous presence. Okay, what is your takeaway from this paragraph? Okay, so people are drinking wine, from the street. Now, I know you're thinking, how many of you thought it was weird they're feeding wine to babies? Yeah, we're feeding wine to infants. So let's talk about why it is that we're feeding wine to infants. And that is, we don't have clean drinking water, really, in the cities, right? Drinking water the way that we do it's fairly new, all right? Water was not generally drinkable. You didn't have water purification systems. There's no sewer system. That's something else I just want you to think for a minute about, is that there are no sewer systems, so people just like dump their chamber pots into the street, and now we're drinking wine from it. Delicious. All right, all right, salmonella-y, yeah, E. coli. No. So,
it gives it a twinge of ammonia.
There you go. So, babies, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to feed babies wine, right, or beer, to feed children wine or beer. That's what you drank, right, because you couldn't really drink water. But wine and beer were safe to drink, okay? And so we have all of these...
Sounded like that.
What?
No wonder their accent sounded like that.
Right? So we have all of these people that are digging up the wine. So something else I want you to think about is to lame all living creatures that approach them. The regular stones. What does it mean to lame people?
To make them unable to destroy their way.
Right, to cripple them. Or so this area, wherever it is that we are right now, What type of area is this?
Poor area.
Yes, this is a
Very pointy area.
okay. This is a poor neighborhood. All right. All right. So, what motifs are we seeing? Any motifs here? I want you guys to think back when we talked about the titles. Any motifs showing up? I'll tell you that stone is a motif. The irregular stones, stone is a motif. Okay? All right, here we go. Oh, and this piece right here, there might have been a scavenger on the street. If anyone acquainted with it could have believed in such a miraculous presence. Basically, they're saying that the streets were cleaned. People cleaned the streets from drinking this wine. They just did the wine and the mud. The streets were clean when they were done. And the idea of having someone come in and clean the streets would be miraculous. Okay? All right. Oh, one other thing. There was a word that really stuck out to me in here. Mutilated, right? Earthenware. Let's talk about the word mutilated. Positive or negative connotation?
Very negative.
It's negative. Okay, so we have all of these words, right? Like to lame all living creatures, irregular stones, mutilated earthenware, mud embankments, right? All of these things, this really negative connotation, right? That life here is ugly and broken and brutal. Okay, much like the cask that falls on the streets. A shrill sound of laughter and of amused voices. Voices of men, women, and children resounded in the street while this wine game lasted. So this is a game. And what do you remember about games?
They're fun.
They're fun. Okay, thank you. But do you remember from the titles? 52, a hand at cards, the game
card
made.
games. The card games.
Right, we have this motif again. There was little roughness in the sport and much playfulness. There was a special companionship in it, an observable inclination on the part of everyone to join some other one, which led especially among the luckier or lighter-hearted to frolicsome embraces, drinking of healths, shaking of hands, and even joining of hands and dancing a dozen together. When the wine was gone and the places where it had been most abundant were raked into a gridiron pattern by fingers, these demonstrations ceased as suddenly as they had broken out. The man who had left his saw, what does the saw remind you of?
The guillotine?
Okay, so maybe the guillotine, but also the woodman. What's a woodman? Who's the woodman? Fate. Okay. Sticking in the firewood he was cutting, set in motion again, and the women who had left on a doorstep the little pot of hot ashes at which she had been trying to soften the pain in her own starved fingers and toes, or those of her child, returned to it. Men with bare arms, matted locks, and cadaverous faces, who had emerged into the winter light from cellars, moved away to descend again, and a gloom gathered on the scene that appeared more natural to it than sunshine. So what happens when this wine breaks in the street? What happens to the people? Okay, so the broken wine cask brings short-lived unity and fun. But it quickly goes back to where it was before.
Sounds like the Thirst Games are a lot more fun than the Hunger Games.
Yes, I would argue that the Thirst Games are probably more fun than the Hunger Games. The wine was red wine and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris. So that's where we are. We are in Saint Antoine in Paris, where it was spilled.
Where is Saint Antoine? I keep getting talked about.
Okay, so let's look up Saint Antoine. So it's going to be Saint Anthony, right? Probably.
Google.
We're Googling him.
Yeah.
Ooh. All right.
Overhead.
All right.
In the way.
So here we go.
Located near the Bastille.
What?
Located near the Bastille.
It is located near the Bastille, but we're looking at who Saint Antoine is. It's the name of the neighborhood. He was a doctor and the saint of finding things or lost people. Okay? So he's a saint of finding lost people. That might be important. Okay, the wine was red wine and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris where it was spilled. It had stained many hands too, and many faces, and many naked feet. So we know these people don't have shoes, right? Oh, naked feet, no shoes. Shoemaking is a...
Chapter.
All right. And many wooden shoes. The hands of the man who sawed the wood. Oh,
Woodman.
man, we've got the woodman again. Left red marks on the billets, and the forehead of the woman who nursed her baby was stained with the stain of the old rag she wound about her head again.
I kind of feel like that's Mary.
It does kind of sound like Virgin Mary, doesn't it? Those who had been greedy with the staves of the cask had acquired a tigerish smear about the mouth. And one tall joker, so besmirched, his head more out of a long squalid bag of a nightcap than in it, scrawled upon the wall with his finger dipped in the muddy wine lees. Blood. So, the wine here symbolizes what?
Blood.
Okay, so we have wine equals blood. So, what is this showing us if their faces are smeared in blood, wine and all of that? What does that show us about the people?
They're vicious.
Yeah, there's bloodlust. Okay. And in case you missed that, here we go. There was to come, the time was to come, when that wine too is blood, would be spilled on the street stones. Here's our stone motif. And when the stain of it would be red upon many there. Okay, so this is talking about what? What's the time to come?
Revolution.
Right. French Revolution. And now that the clouds settled on Saint Antoine, which a momentary gleam had driven from his sacred countenance. So whose sacred countenance?
Saint Antoine.
The darkness of it was heavy. Cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and want were the lords in waiting on the saintly presence. Nobles of great power, all of them, but most especially the last. Okay, what they're saying right here, we're personifying these things, right? And I should probably scoot that up so you can see it. So Dickens is personifying not only Saint Antoine, but also cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and want are being personified, okay? And he calls them nobles of great power, but most especially the last. What's the last one? Want. Okay? So the most powerful lord or noble in Saint Antoine is want, desire. Okay? Okay. Samples of a people that had undergone a terrible grinding and re-grinding in the mill, and certainly not in the fabulous mill which ground old people young, shivered at every corner, passed in and out at every doorway, looked from every window, fluttered in every vestige of a garment that the wind shook. The mill which had worked them down was the mill that grinds young people old. The children had ancient faces and grave voices, and upon them and upon the grown faces, and plowed into every furrow of age and coming up afresh, was the sigh, hunger. Okay, so people, he creates this metaphor of life as a grinder or a mill, okay? And here, this mill wears people down. It grinds them down. It makes young people old. Children look old. Everyone is ground down because of hunger were starving to death. It was prevalent everywhere. Hunger was pushed out of the tall houses in the wretched clothing that hung upon poles and lines. Hunger was patched into them with straw and rag and wood and paper. Hunger was repeated in every fragment of the small modicum of firewood that the man sawed off. So again, we have woodmen again. Hunger stared down from the smokeless chimneys and started up from the filthy street that had no offal among its refuse or of anything to eat. Okay, this is saying that, what's offal? Do you guys know what offal is? It's entrails.
Oh, fun. Oh, awful. Oh, actually close.
Yeah, or offal. Okay, it's entrails. So people are so hungry and starving that there isn't even any like things that you would normally cast aside when you butchered an animal. There's nothing left. Anything that's edible has been eaten. Okay? Among its refuse of anything to eat. Hunger was the inscription on the baker's shelves, written in every small loaf of his scanty stock of bad bread. At the sausage stop, in every dead dog preparation that was offered for sale. Hunger rattled its dry bones among the roasting chestnuts and the turned cylinder. Hunger was shred into atomics in every farthing porringer of husky chips of potato, fried with some reluctant drops of oil. Hunger personified and everywhere. Okay, let me ask you a question. Why is Dickens telling us about the hunger? Why does he go into such detail? Why couldn't he just say they're hungry? Why is it so important to show us how hungry they are?
To show the level
Okay, so it's the level of desperation that's the driving force for revolution. Its abiding place was in all things fitted to it, a narrow winding street full of offense and stench, with other narrow winding streets diverging, all peopled by rags and nightcaps, and all smelling of rags and nightcaps, and all visible things with a brooding look about them that looked ill. It hunted, in the hunted air of the people, there was yet some wild beast thought of the possibility of turning at bay. Depressed and slinking though they were, eyes of fire were not wanting among them, nor compressed lips, white with what they suppressed, nor foreheads knitted into the likeness of the gallows rope they mused about enduring or inflicting. So people are fascinated with death. People thinking about death, theirs and their oppressors. The trade signs, and they were almost as many as the shops, were all grim illustrations of want. The butcher and the porkman painted up only the leanest scrags of meat, the baker the coarsest of meager loaves. The people, rudely pictured as drinking in the wine shops, croaked over their scanty measures of thin wine and beer, and were gloweringly confidential together. Nothing was represented in a flourishing condition, save tools and weapons. But the cutler's knives and axes were sharp and bright. The smith's hammers were heavy, and the gunmaker's stock was murderous. The crippling stones of the pavement, with their many little reservoirs of mud and water, had no footways, but broke off abruptly at the doors. The kennel, to make amends, ran down the middle of the street, when it ran at all, which was only after heavy rains, and then it ran by many eccentric fits into the houses. Across the street's wide intervals, one clumsy lamp was slung by a rope. What does that sound like?
like someone's being.
Yeah, like gallows again. Gallows. Okay. By a rope and pulley. At night, when the lamplighter had let these down and lighted and hoisted them again, a feeble grove of dim wicks swung in a sickly manner overhead as if they were at sea. Okay, and sea is another motif.
Do you push it up there?
There we go. Better? Okay. Indeed, they were at sea, and the ship and crew were in the peril of a tempest. So what's this metaphorical tempest we're talking about? What's a tempest? It's a storm. So what storm is coming? Revolution. Okay, so we have a storm and we have the sea. For the time was to come when the gaunt scarecrows of that region should have watched the lamplighter in their idleness and hunger so long as to conceive the idea of improving on his method and hauling up men by those ropes and pulleys to flare upon the darkness of their condition. But the time was not to come yet, and every wind that blew over France shook the rags of the scarecrows in vain, for the birds, fine of song and feather, took no warning. Okay, guys, the birds, it's the nobility. Okay? So, we have this, extended metaphor that the people of St. Antoine's, and I'm just going to abbreviate it, are scarecrows. And the nobility are birds. Okay. So what Dickens is doing here is introducing us on a personal level to St. Antoine, the neighborhood, and what it means for the people who live there. Okay? So that we understand why the revolution happens. Now I'm going to tell you that later this sympathetic ear, this sympathetic portrayal does shift. Okay? All right. Any questions?